Tips and recommendations for working with victims. A conversation with law enforcement-based victim advocates. We asked 3 experienced law enforcement-based victim advocates to share their thoughts on best practices for working with victims of crime and helping protect their rights. We are grateful to them for sharing their experience. Why is honoring crime victim choice and empowerment important?
So when we come in contact with victims, most everything that they have been involved in, the incident, whatever that may be, is completely out of their control. And so by allowing them the choices, we're helping them to reestablish some control and ultimately, helping to empower them. So I think it's extremely important that they're involved in decision-making and, or at least, to the extent possible, but that are, they're aware of things that are happening. I think the more information they have, the more power they have to reestablish some of that control that was lost.
It's not only important, I think it's imperative to their safety and to so much that's going to happen after this case is over. So if we think about survivor autonomy, the criminal case and the intersection that they're going to have with us is such a small piece of their entire life and everything that's going on. If you think about their safety, their children's safety, depending on what type of crime it is, this is just such a small piece. And for them to have choices and a voice in this process, because everything that they say to us, everything that they do with this case is going to have implications for them for so far, just so long after.
Can you tell us about your initial conversation with a crime victim, including when and how you talk about privacy?
The initial conversation with a victim of any crime, whether it's in person or on the telephone, is more than just an initial contact or crisis intervention. It's the start of helping the victim to understand their role in the criminal justice process, their rights, and help them to understand how to make choices and how to exercise those rights. So after an initial introduction, your name, your role, the reason for that contact, information about confidentiality and privilege is really, really important and needs to be introduced very quickly, because along with that, victims who may be uncomfortable with how their information could be shared should be directed to community-based agencies.
That's something that should be had, a conversation should be had very early on with the survivor that you're working with. And I say that because the way that I interpret that, the way that we've learned to interpret that, is that it's really their right to protect their story. And if they start sharing their story early on and don't know things that could be shared or things that we can't protect by them sharing that very confidential, private information with us, that could have such serious harm and effect on them for so long, and things that we can't undo.
Employed by a law enforcement agency, much of what they say to us, we can't guarantee confidentiality, that, that information may have to be shared and often does have to be shared.
How and when do you talk about mandatory reporting with a crime victim?
I explain mandatory reporting to victims that there are certain professionals that work in the system that are mandated by certain laws. And the whole point behind the law is to protect children, and especially because children don't often have a voice, and to make sure that they're safe and not being harmed. And that as a professional in this agency, I am a mandatory reporter, and that throughout our conversations, if I did learn anything or there was anything that rose to the level of needing to be reported in terms of a child being harmed or being abused or neglected, then I would have to report that.
Any suspicion of neglect or abuse of a child, maybe of an elderly person or somebody with disabilities, a vulnerable person. And so if I'm aware that there's neglect or child abuse, I am a mandated reporter. And so I think there are some options that we can give victims, again, as far as, maybe helping them be a part of that process and making that report. And also helping to develop a plan if, maybe our family services is going to get involved with that family. So being upfront with victims, especially in domestic violence cases, that if there is, a disclosure of neglect or abuse, that we are mandated reporters and that has to be reported.
How and when do you tell victims about their rights?
Yeah, so again, it's important to talk to victims about their rights as early on in the process as appropriate, because there are rights that are afforded to victims that they need to be aware of from the beginning stages, from when they make that report all the way through the process.
So initially, while reassuring them that they do have some rights, we want to break it down and touch on the initial rights at small bites, because during crisis, it's very overwhelming, and we certainly don't want to be providing them this overwhelming big picture of what's going to happen in the future. So rather than that, we're keeping them apprised as the status of their case may change.
So I think the sooner the better to inform victims of their rights, because their rights obviously apply throughout the case. And so I try and do it immediately. However, depending on the crime category and the circumstances, it may have to wait a day or two, depending on if it's a call out. And, our agency that I worked for was 24/7. And so if you're called out at 1 a.m. on a homicide or, on a call out case where your whole goal is going to be stabilization and that crisis intervention, then that may not be the time where they're going to even be able to retain or take in what you're sharing with them. So it may have to be a later date. But for the most part, I would say the first or second interaction is really important.
What rights do you discuss early on with a crime victim?
So the rights that I spend the most time on early on are going to be that right to being notified of an offender's release because of that safety issue. For sure, that's one that I focus on a lot. Also, the right to victim compensation. Early on, the conversation is going to be one of their right to apply for victim compensation and walking them through that process. And so that one is also one that I cover. Like I said, I do give them the entire list of rights during our conversations because I kind of want to skim over all of them. But their right to be present and participate in proceedings and to be notified of those proceedings is another really important one. And some of them don't necessarily want to be there or may not want to be there, and that's okay. But then they want to be able to follow up and know what happened at it. And then some of them absolutely want to be there and they're coming up quick. Those hearings sometimes can be, very quick in the process, early in the process. And so I want them to not miss out on any of those things.
What is one tip you want to share about working with crime victims?
My number one tip is just to be there, supporting the victim, helping them to feel safe emotionally and physically in the moment, and then provide very small bites of information as appropriate. But always be prepared for that follow-up and provide the same information again in 24 hours, check in with them and continue to provide the same information if need be, and then start to expand it as their ability to absorb that information or utilize it comes into play.
When you are sharing information with somebody that's experienced trauma, it is very likely they are going to lose the piece of paper you handed them at midnight when you were on scene. It is very likely they are going to not remember your name or what you said. And I have seen professionals sometimes get frustrated with victims and almost argumentative where, the victim will say, I didn't know that, or nobody told me that. And somebody will be like, oh yes, I gave you that yellow piece of paper, and we can sometimes get a little bit defensive. And I guess my tip would be understanding and patience that trauma affects and crisis affects people's ability to retain information and to understand information. And so to not take that personally, to be patient, be willing to explain things, whether it's multiple times, answer questions you've already answered, and not be frustrated.
So I think that it's extremely important that police and police-based advocates have a strong knowledge of the impact of trauma on victims, and that it can be a result of one incident, or it might be a result of a history across their lifetime. There may have been, several incidents. And so understanding the impact of trauma, I think, is extremely important. Understanding, again, that safety and security, making sure that victims feel safe, providing victims with choices, whether it's something really small, like, are you comfortable being interviewed in this room, or would you prefer if we are here? Allowing victims to have choices throughout that process, making sure you're very clear with victims what your roles are and what the boundaries are. And again, leading back to, what our limitations are on confidentiality.
The National Crime Victim Law Institute works to promote victims' rights and voices in our justice systems. We hope that the words of these experienced law enforcement-based victim advocates can help you as you work to help empower crime victims to activate their rights. To learn more about the National Crime Victim Law Institute, go to www.ncvli.org. To learn more about the law enforcement-based Victim Services Program, go to www.theiacp.org or use the QR code on the screen.